In three. Actually, no, it just started. Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome to TalkBox with Oktavists. I'm your host, Xander Mayan, and we've got Joe Decker. And please introduce yourself.
Oh, my name is Joe Decker, and I'm just here with Xander interviewing Benjamin Cramer.
Now, Benjamin, can you tell us more about yourself for everyone watching the video?
Yeah, my name is Ben Cramer. I'm originally from Minneapolis, Minnesota. I live out here in Aberdeen, Scotland. I'm getting my PhD in music composition with Paul Mueller. And I've spent both this and my master's research heavily into vocal techniques, particularly extended vocal techniques. It was overtone singing for my master's, and this time around, I'm focusing a lot more on subharmonics, things like that.
Nice, nice. So this first part of the interview will be my part, and the second part will be Joe's. So first off, what we're going to be talking about. So Ben, you're a choral getting your PhD for choral composition, correct?
Correct.
What's your favorite part about composing music that really sticks out to you, made you want to focus on this career?
The thing that really made me want to pursue choral music is it's basically this profound impact that we have as musicians. We talk a lot about resonance in music. If you hit a tuning fork and you set it on a desk, the desk will vibrate and it'll amplify that frequency because it's a resonant frequency. And we tend to have similar things with emotions. So with music, you can have a composer who went through some extreme emotion, maybe it's loss, and they write a piece. And even though the piece might not be explicitly about loss, it might not mention it at all, we human beings, when we rehearse and perform this music, we're able to totally understand that feeling. And then when we communicate it to an audience, they in turn can feel that loss. I think of it as a sort of emotional resonance.
Yes.
So you have no communication explicitly between the composer and the audience, but you can actually, through music, communicate the exact same feeling that the composer is feeling, just using a language other than the spoken language.
Fascinating. So now that we've got that part, let's go to the fun stuff, the good stuff. All right. So first off, I want to see if you can correct something for our fans. What's the difference between the term subharmonic singing and subharmonic technique that we use when we sing? Because apparently from you, it's a little bit different.
Well, there's a lot. So the issue right now is a lot of these techniques have been around for a very, very long time. And
Yes.
A lot of people refer to them exclusively as like Tuvan throat singing or Tibetan throat singing, things like that. And there are certainly specific traditions in that region of the world, but these subharmonic techniques have actually originated all over the world. In parts of Africa, there's a really, really fascinating one in Sardinia, in Italy. There's Inuit throat singing. There's completely separate cultures, separated by thousands of miles and hundreds of years, have all arrived at similar things. So there's not really... I try to avoid using too many terms that imply a specific cultural connotation, because along with that, there's so many other things to take into consideration. But subharmonic singing and subharmonic techniques really just kind of, it's anything that utilizes producing an undertone by, you know, a standard fundamental, the same way that we have overtone singing. There's a lot of different ways to do it. And there's a lot of different terms that are used kind of interchangeably. So it's a little bit of a gray area.
Yes. So the next part that we're going to talk about is, so we're going to go in order of so this interview is purely off of what I found interesting, because last interview was, I asked the Discord server, they asked some pretty good questions, but this one, it's more about questions that I have for you, because personally, I was really interested in what you have to say for what I have to know. So first off, the subharmonic technique that we use when we call subharmonics, which bass 2 yang uses, where it goes, ooh. Can you tell us the science behind that technique?
Yeah, so that technique is referred to a few different ways. Some people call it fry singing, fry mixture. Some people call it growl. Some people call it srobas. Essentially, what we're doing with that technique is applying the pulse register. So you have the 4 registers of the voice. We're most familiar with our modal register, which is our chest voice. And then you have the head voice, falsetto. You have your whistle tone techniques, and then the pulse register, which is our vocal fry. And I mean, even now, still, we don't really look at pulse register as a legitimate register of the voice.
Correct.
I know a lot of pedagogues will say even that you should avoid doing anything with fry, because they just believe that it's inherently unhealthy, and they just try to steer us away from it. But basically, what we're doing with that subharmonic technique is by applying the pulse register as a filter into a modal tone.
Interesting.
The best way I can sort of explain it, and a lot of people will simplify this and say that the vocal cords are vibrating at 2 different speeds, which is kind of true, kind of not. The vocal folds vibrate with 3 different kinds of waves. And there's also a 2 mass model approach when we actually talk about the vocal folds themselves. So they're making contact in different ways. We think of it sort of like this one-dimensional thing that comes together and separates. But you actually have, even though they're very thin, there is more surface area that comes together. I should probably model this cameras this way. There is more surface area that comes together. So you have this kind of motion, you have this kind of motion, and then if you and I mean, this is like from the side, if these are the vocal folds, they can make these kind of motions, which creates one wave. They can just click together. Or if you look at it from the top, there's other kinds of waves like that as well. So with that, you can get things like diplophonia, which is actually producing 2 different pitches with the vocal folds. You hear that a lot. It's actually used, termed more as a vocal disorder with the speaking voice. When people, it happens a lot when our voices are changing, and you kind of get like this a little bit, when everything's changing. But that's also something that you can develop through yodeling and things like that. But so that's what that sounds like when you're actually producing 2 different pitches with the vocal cords.
Interesting.
What's happening with that other subharmonic technique is you have the wave that oscillates, and then you have basically a periodic interruption of energy, which will happen either once every 2, 3, 4, 5 cycles, etc. And that little extra spike in energy creates its own oscillation. So we interpret that as another wave, even though it's technically part of the same initial wave. Just like when we talk about overtone singing, you're not producing more tones with your voice. You're actually just highlighting what's already there. So with the undertones, and Tao has a wonderful example of this when he takes the tuning fork and touches it to a piece of paper very, very gently. And what's happening is instead of striking it every single time, it'll go every other time or something like that. So yeah, I feel like that was a very in the weeds kind of explanation, but it's not. I think the perception is that like the left side versus the right side are going at two different speeds or something like that. It's not exactly that. It's that we produce a very complex wave. It's not a pure, simple cosine wave like in math class, because that would just be a pure tone, like on sound generators. So every sound we make with the voice is a collection and a combination of all these different waves together. So when you utilize that technique, the ear actually in your brain filters it out.
Fascinating. Thanks, Ben. So the next part we're going to talk about is I talked with Tao Yang yesterday, and we talked about the limits of the chest voice very, very briefly. But he did mention that he talked with you actually about how it's physically impossible for a voice to project a C1 in full modal chest. What is the limit of a chest voice range, do you think?
So it's hard to say. It's like saying, what's the heaviest thing a human being could lift?
Yes.
You know, I mean, we all know with good technique and exercises and training, we can expand the range of our voice.
Yes.
But it's more so about sustainability, I think. Yes, you can do exercises to extend your chest range, both up and a little bit down. But the problem is there's only so much that you can, thicken your vocal folds with that muscle to try and push the chest register down. It's the same thing when you try to take your chest register up. You can get some really, really powerful high chest notes. I know like bass baritones that can sing high B flats, and it sounds incredible, but that kind of comes at a price because it's not super sustainable. You can't do that over and over and over and over and over again. So it's the same thing when you listen to people in choir, people who maybe their comfortable modal range kind of drops out at like the bottom of the bass clef. When they try to go down, you can hear the tension. You can hear that they're pushing. They're trying to trying to really reach those notes. So yeah, I mean, you can try and extend your chest range, but it sort of becomes there's kind of diminishing returns. Yeah, maybe you might be able to hit those notes, but yeah, they don't project well. The same thing as if you're a tenor and you're trying to sing high C's all the time. Eventually, you're going to realize that mixing in your falsetto and head voice, having a more blended sound, is going to allow you to sing in that range all day long. So with a lot of these bass techniques, I mean, there's a lot of kind of discourse, I think, between people saying, well, they're just doing fry, or they're just doing cardigira, or they look at subharmonics as cheating. As a composer, I don't know. I love the sound, and I think whatever you can do to create that sound, as long as it's healthy, reproducible, sounds pleasant, as a conductor and a composer, I don't care if I, have a bunch of guys that can, get down to a low C, maybe twice a day. But if they're using subharmonics, it's so much easier on the voice, and they'll be able to do something like the Rachmaninoff Vespers and not break a sweat. Yes.
So the next question we have for you, and this is the question that I've been asked a lot actually for you, is what is VVM, and how many different types of VVM are there?
Oh, okay. Well, first of all, excuse me. First of all, I need to definitely give credit to Dr. Leonardo Fuchs in Brazil. We kind of look at him as sort of the godfather of a lot of this research, and I think he's due a lot more attribution than he's given, because he's I mean, if you've ever talked with him or met with him, he's a fantastic researcher. But the way that he defines VVM stands for vocal ventricular mode phonation. And basically, what that means is when I talk about the Srobos or that Fry kind of singing, you're using that combined sine wave, that combined frequency to create these other tones. With this, with VVM, you're using the ventricular folds, which fall or which are just a little bit above the glottis. And they're a little bit thicker, a little bit larger, but we don't adduct them very often. They're there for a couple of reasons, primarily as a tool to kind of keep us from choking. So, when you cough, when you clear your throat, things like that, that's mainly their purpose, is to kind of help guard the glottis from damage, things like that. And if you have a cold or, there's mucus or something like that, they can vibrate and shake things loose. So we don't have as much control over them as we do with the regular vocal folds, where we can just add them to, we can't just adduct them at will. We have to look to more external muscles for that kind of adduction. So that's where a lot of the different techniques that you've probably heard defined come into play. Things like Kargira, Sigut, Hume, Gyuke, so on and so forth.
Yes.
A lot of those different techniques all utilize VVM, and VVM just means that you are vibrating the ventricular folds at a ratio of 1 to 2, 1 to 3, 1 to 4, etc. So you have your fundamental pitch being generated by the vocal folds, and your ventricular folds are vibrating at half the speed, a third of the speed, etc., which gives you your octave, 2 octaves, octave and a fifth, etc. Subharmonics that mirror the overtone series.
Interesting. So the next question is from my fan base. They were wondering, what type of VVM does Xander use, and why does it sound so natural and so close to chest?
Which type do you use?
Yes.
To be perfectly honest, I don't like to put a lot of labels on things. I think about it just the same way as a lot of other vocal pedagogy. I had the issue when I was in high school, where my voice teacher told me that I had a very specific kind of voice.
Mm-hmm, yes.
And at the time I was 15, 16. My voice still hasn't fully matured. It's not going to do that until I'm in my mid to late 30s.
Yes.
But at the time, I just said, oh, well, I am this kind of singer. I have this kind of voice, and I'm going to start exploring this type of repertoire. And what I was doing was I was making musical choices based on what I thought my voice was going to develop into, rather than looking at the repertoire based on what my voice needed. So I don't like to get too in the weeds with terminology there, and also because just from an academic standpoint, there's so many problems with a lot of the terminology that we use. I mean, when we refer to Hume, Sigut, Kargira, etc., those are all styles of Tuvan throat singing. And I know people that will use very, very, very similar sounding techniques, but they developed it from basically just kind of playing around, YouTube tutorials, things like that, experimenting, and then they found their own style. And I know people that have actually gone there and learned it from people in the region. So it sort of, it just, I think it creates more problems to use that kind of terminology, because then you say, well, what really is it and what isn't it? I like to think in terms of the VVM because it's really just talking about what is actually happening with the physiology.
Yes.
So basically right now with subharmonics, there's probably about three main ways to create subharmonics that I'm aware of, and then everything else spans from there. There's the VVM, which includes a lot of what we would consider the throat singing, because it uses the ventricular folds. There's the Strobos, which is the fry kind of mixture. And then there's ingressive phonation, which there really is not enough research on right now. So I don't want to get too much into that, because it's very, very new. And there are people that have done research on inward phonation singing, but only a couple people that I've seen demonstrating it as ingressive fry. It's a very powerful technique, but I'm not exactly sure what's going on. I need to read more of the research on that. But yeah, I mean, for the most part, it's all either a subset of VVM or it's the Strobos. The VVM is typically a lot more powerful. The sound is stronger. The volume is stronger, but it also takes a lot longer to learn. It has a higher potential for fatigue and damaging the voice early on. And it can also produce, depending on what you're singing, it can produce a fairly unpleasant sound, depending on how it's used.
Yes. Interesting. So when it comes down to the techniques, I think the world's best right now at VVM would have to be Alex Lukianov. What do you think he uses, and what exactly goes on in his process, do you think, Ben, when Alex Lukianov sings?
It's very hard to speculate based on sound alone. I haven't met the guy. But I've listened to recordings of his speaking voice. It sounds, it sounds like basically he had more of a classical vocal training beforehand, because his speaking voice is actually quite high, but not naturally thin. He sounds, yes. When you listen to opera speakers talk, they talk like this. It's very, it's very balanced. It's a lot in the mask and things like that, because they know that there is inherently a lot of fatigue associated with speaking too much in the chest voice. It's more sustainable, it projects, and it allows you much more control over the vocal mechanism. So I think that's why his voice sounds higher when he speaks. I think he's got a phenomenal modal range, probably. I've listened to a few recordings, and I think if he is using subharmonics, it's because his modal voice is so low, deep, and warm that when he uses the subharmonics, it blends fairly effortlessly. Tao Yang's another perfect example. He's got a very naturally rich, deep modal voice as well.
Yes.
So for him to do the subharmonics, even when it's a little bit higher, it's very difficult to distinguish between the subharmonics and his modal voice, because if you can actually sing a low C comfortably in your modal voice, and then you do the subharmonics and you're getting that, C0 or C1 from the subharmonics, that's going to sound a lot more beefy and impressive than if a tenor tries to hit the same pitch by going down to like the third or fourth subharmonic.
Yes. Interesting. So I'm gonna check how many questions we have over here. Joe, are you still there?
Yeah, sorry about that.
All right. Whoop. That's my mom. Sorry, guys. I guess I was too loud. So, Ben, when it comes to subharmonics and singing in general, what is your preference for perfect placement? Would you say you want more of a pharyngeal larynx type sound? Would you want more placed in the mask in the nasal area? What exactly do you look for when someone sings bass?
It all depends on the context. It depends on the repertoire. As a conductor, the default is always whatever's healthy, whatever's healthy and sustainable. It doesn't really matter to me, or it's not valuable to me as a conductor if I can get somebody who can crank out a couple low B flats, but then they're done for the day.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't really help me. So I always like to be on the lookout for my singers and make sure that whatever techniques they're doing, as long as it's healthy and repeatable, that's going to take precedent. But again, it really depends on the repertoire. 90 whatever percent of the music utilizing the octavist voice is going to be Russian choral music. There's a few folk singers and gospel singers that will do some quartet stuff or solo things. But mainly it's Russian music, and mainly that's typically in a minor mode.
Mm-hmm.
The reason why that's important is when we look at the normal harmonic series, the overtone series, the brighter your vowels get, typically, the more brightness you apply in the second and third formant of the voice, the clearer and higher the partials will be, the harmonics.
Mm-hmm.
So if you are singing, let's say you're singing a piece in E minor, and you're down on an E, and let's say that it's an ah vowel. If you brighten that ah too much, you're going to highlight a G sharp as the I can't remember, 9th or 11th harmonic. I'm having a brain fart right now, but the rest of the choir is tuning to E minor.
Yeah.
And even though the pitch that you're singing is an E natural, perfectly in tune, because you're highlighting a G sharp, it's actually going to clash with whoever's singing the G natural in the chord. So that's why we talk about so much about timbre.
Mm-hmm.
And you can also get what's it called? You can get certain kinds of dissonance that happen when the vowels themselves are out of tune. For instance, if the altos are singing a G natural and your overtone is a G sharp, that's just a semitone away from theirs. Each of those sine waves are going to be slightly out of phase because the frequency is just a little bit different. So then you have all these peaks happening at different times. Rather than vibrating together, you start to hear this sort of click going back and forth.
Yes.
In string music, they utilize those as Tartini tones to actually tune. But to a listener, most of the time, we're not really trained to actually focus on the overtones. So when we hear that, we're just like, that sounds kind of not good. You can't really put your finger on it.
Yeah.
Because a lot of the times we're not actually paying attention to those overtones. Mm. So when you're singing something in a minor mode, having those darker vowels to highlight some of the lower fundamentals are going to be more valuable. Which again is why I say it totally depends on the context. If you're singing in Russian, there's two different L's, and one of the deep L sounds inherently puts a lot of tension in the back of the tongue. It's really hard to get to sing some of those words without putting a ton of tension in there.
Yeah.
So yeah, it depends on if you're singing something that has text. It depends on whether it's major, minor, atonal, whatever. And it's also going to depend on the actual entire sonority that the choir is doing. Chesnikov has a wonderful book, which I would highly recommend reading. It's called The Choir and How to Direct It, translated by John C. Romerheim from, I think, Iowa State, maybe University of Iowa. But he talks about how he would often revoice chords when he was conducting his choir, if he felt like the voicing was just not great or ideal, he would change it all up. But if you look at that actual spacing, a lot of times it just outlines the harmonic series. So as an octavist, that you can use that a lot to your advantage, because you can tune to the rest of the choir as well as them tuning to you. So yeah, there's a that's probably just a very long-winded way of saying, different strokes for different folks. Some people are gonna really like that just booming, overpowering bass sound. Some people, I know some choir directors have a philosophy of felt not heard. I think that might be a Robert Shaw thing. Personally, I always like my bass sound to be very present. When I am putting together a choir, I always think of it in 5 voice parts, and that's something I got from Chesnikov's book. You always think of the octavist or the basso profundo as a separate voice part. Baritones and basses get lumped together in choir all the time, but they are completely different voice parts. They have different ranges, they have different timbres, different passagios, everything. There's a lot different between those voices. So, when I set up my choirs, I try to evenly balance them across that. So if I have, I'll do 25 singers, 5 in each part. And then according to Chesnikov, he says, when you want to double the size of your choir, you triple the bass section.
Interesting. So Ben, I'm going to take this time right now to ask you a couple questions about sound produced. I'm going to sing a couple notes for you, and I want you to tell me what you think about the sound quality. And I'm sorry, it's probably going to be really bad sounding.
I'm sure it'll be great.
But
we believe in you.
We're gonna sing a relatively easy note for me. C#2. But we're gonna think about. I want you to tell me which one for you is. How would I make my bass BVM sound more rich if I started sounding like this? What would I do to make it sound more rich and full if I used BVM?
So the real trick is going to be the back of the tongue in that case, because you want to create more space in the throat to allow it to resonate and to sound deeper. But the problem is, in order to get the ventricular folds to adduct enough to vibrate, you still have to apply pressure to the sides of to these muscles to actually get them to adduct and vibrate.
Yes.
So you can't relax that, open it, and contract it at the same time. So you're gonna have to think about the back of your tongue. If you can relax the back of your tongue enough, that can come forward just a little bit, and that'll create more space so that you still have the adduction of the ventricular folds, and that's still working for you, but you have a little bit more space, and that should increase the resonant chamber. So what I would do, can you do you know how to do overtone singing?
Yes.
So what I would do as an exercise is stick your tongue out of your mouth and just do a line through the vowels, only using the back of your tongue. So it'd be like that.
Okay, let me try that.
Just try it on just try it on a regular phonation.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. Get the tongue all the way out of the mouth. We're focusing more on the back of the tongue rather than the overtones. Yeah, so try this. Actually grab it. Hold on to it.
All right.
Yeah. Hold on to the tip of your tongue and make sure that it stays out of the teeth, because a lot of times it'll just keep coming. It'll keep arching and coming back. If you can get it so that you're only isolating the very, very back of the tongue. Like that. Yep.
Oh wow.
Okay, so do you feel that? Do you feel that difference in the back of the tongue?
Yeah.
So now try it again. Try the VVM.
All right.
And you don't have to stick out your tongue, but focus on that same openness of the ah. Yeah. And can you do the vowel more of an Yeah. Now create more space in the second formant. So at the kind of by your molars,
Okay.
almost like you're gargling like mouthwash or something like that. Try that just to get that feeling of more space right here.
All right.
Yeah. I don't know if you could hear that, but that was a marked difference. I'm trying to remember. Yeah, some of the other techniques that I like to kind of just work on relaxing and loosening the ventricular folds, like growl techniques, things like that. I used to do a wheezing thing when I was a kid, which was my older brother had asthma, and I would always listen to, when you'd have an asthma attack and things would swell up, you'd be but that kind of open relaxation will get the ventricular folds to kind of work on their own. Those kind of growl things. Mm-hmm. And then, just imagine that you have a bunch of mouthwash in the back of your mouth, and you just need to create that space down here at the back of the tongue. Mm-hmm. And then work basically backwards. Open up everything you can open here and up here. And then by the time you're projecting, you're just using the tongue, the lips, and the jaw to just shape whatever vowel you need to. And I think that'll help things blend better with the singers around you, so it doesn't sound so much like here's an ah vowel and here's like a
Yeah.
You can blend it better into it.
Yeah, that was really helpful. So now instead of sounding like it sounds like more of that.
I mean, keep working on it. One of the tips that Fuchs told me was to kind of imagine the sensation of like trying to push a burp.
Okay.
That actually really helped. And that one actually helps a little bit with Strobos too, because you're artificially lowering the larynx just a little bit. You don't want to push it down. But if you can just get it to kind of come down a little bit, that'll give you, again, more space for everything to sort of resonate.
All right. Thanks. All right. We're going to move to the second part of the interview, and this is where Joe comes in. Joe is going to be talking about something a little bit different than me, but I'm hoping that you will have fun with Joe. Right now, I have to finish eating my chicken nuggets. So have fun, guys.
Yeah.
Okay. I have a variety of different questions. I've been listening to the conversation you guys have been having. I've been writing down, more specific things. And I'm going to start off with things about, like, your life. At the moment, how old are you?
I'm 29.
So you're 29. And I heard you say earlier that you have an overtone singing major. Is that correct?
I focused. So my master's was dual master's in composition and conducting.
Okay.
And I chose to focus my research on extended techniques, and there was an intense focus on overtone singing in choral music. So it wasn't so much on the technique itself, but also how it's used in choral music and how it can be used in choral music.
Okay. What did your research entail?
A lot of it was looking at different pieces of music, different choral pieces, and composers that used overtones. So there was everything from, past life melodies. The composer's escaping me, Sarah something. But her piece is very heavily reliant on overtones, but it's just kind of like a big section in the beginning of the piece. The names. Ooh, this is bad. The names are escaping me. There was a really cool one, really cool piece called Ramkali, which was arranged by Ethan Sperry. He does a lot of really cool arrangements of like Indian ragas and things like that. There's one. I'm losing the name, and this is going to really frustrate me because there's this one guy, Steven something, and he wrote a number of pieces. He did a video for the ACDA as well, talking about integrating overtones in choral music, and he would do like polyphonic overtones and things like that. Sort of like he wrote a couple of like Renaissance type pieces where he would sing the fundamental and then have the overtones creating the counter melody. Wolfgang Saus is probably one of the best resources on overtone singing that I can think of. He conducts the European Overtone Choir. He does a lot of research on overtones, and he helped create the Voce Vista software, formerly Overtone Analyzer, which is a really, 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 really helpful piece of software for singers, pedagogues, because you can sing into it, see the spectrogram of all of your overtones, the undertones, everything like that. It's great for analyzing. But it's a really good tool also for teaching singing, because you can actually show, hey, here's what the singer's format actually looks like. Here is, you can see what you're doing with your voice, how that's actually making it more prominent, which is really invaluable.
Yeah. So one of my, hold on. This is a little side note. You mentioned the ACDA.
Yeah.
My choir actually sang for an ACDA convention with the Puerto Rican University Choir, and I thought that was it was very fun. Next question is just a personal thing. How do you pronounce the different, throat singing techniques? Because I've been just like reading it like, what's it called? Phonetically, and just like going off of English, but how is it actually pronounced?
I am not an expert on that. The pronunciation, so are you familiar with Roomful of Teeth?
No.
Oh, okay. Right. Well, first of all, write that down. That's Roomful of Teeth is a vocal ensemble based in the US, and their entire mission is to basically explore every single type of music that can be produced with the human voice. They go and they study with experts. They'll do everything from jazz, vocal jazz. They'll do belting techniques, opera. They do throat singing, VVM, overtone singing, Inuit singing. They'll get heavy metal singers to come in and teach them how to like scream. They're a really amazing group, Grammy-winning ensemble. Wow. And there's a piece by Carolyn Shaw, one of their altos, called Partita for 8 Voices. Won the Pulitzer Prize. And it's one of the pieces that it's one of those kind of like magic choral pieces that you can show to people who don't like choral music, and absolutely blow their mind, like hands down. One of the coolest choral pieces there is. But anyway, I interviewed Brad Wells, their director, and he's written a few pieces for them as well. So the pronunciations were what I gleaned from that interview. So I can't really call myself an expert on it.
Okay.
I believe the kume is the overarching overtone singing style from that region, and that's spelled sometimes with an X and O's with umlauts, and sometimes with a K, KH, I believe. Sigut is the other one, SYG something. Kargira is at least the way that I have been pronouncing it. But again, all of these terms are things that I have been, it's like second, third, fourth hand information. So I haven't sat down and actually talked with someone who, lives in this region and grew up singing these things. So, I can't really call myself an expert on that. Okay.
Yeah, because I think at least more than I do, because I've been pronouncing like Kargara, Sigit, just does not sound, that accurate. But also a follow-up question, have you like sung with any of these techniques in a proper way?
Not with subharmonics. I utilize, I did a lot with overtone singing because, this all started way back in my undergrad. Where I went to undergrad, Luther College, it's a college of 2,500 people, but there's 1,000 musicians and like 700 singers. So it can be a little tricky as a music major to, you don't have the same resources that you get at a conservatory. So studying composition is sort of its own world, and then wanting to do choral composition is in another added layer of difficulty. So I would gather my friends and I would put them together, rehearse them, and do my own recording sessions. And there were a number of pieces that I really liked growing up that got me interested in this sort of different sound world. So I'd go to practice rooms and just experiment with different techniques, and then write these little etudes, 30 seconds long usually, and then get this group together and record them and try things out. So I was more focused back then on overtone singing because it's a lot healthier. It's a lot healthier. It's easier to kind of teach to a choir without having to worry about whether or not it's going to be sustainable. There's as a conductor, your singer's vocal health is your responsibility. When you work with professionals and people that have advanced degrees and training, of course they know their voices and they know what's good and what's bad, and they're very good at saying, hey, we need to I only got like 3 more takes in me, and then we gotta call it a rest. But in high school and college, it's really easy to just push people way beyond their limits. So for me, that was sort of, I did a couple of experiments with VVM in a practice room, and I didn't know what it was at the time. I didn't know any of the terms, and I was so freaked out by the sound that happened that I just said, oh, I'm never doing this again. I was so worried that it was going to cause nodules and things like that. So I just said, nope, only focusing on these kind of different techniques. So everything that I've been doing now with subharmonics, that's why I'm doing so much research into the pedagogy, because it's one thing to use these techniques. It's something completely different to write for these techniques. Because if I write a piece using a lot of subharmonics, as a conductor, I have to be able to stand in front of that choir and teach them to do this in a way that's going to be healthy and sustainable and also effective. Because if I can't teach it effectively, it's basically pointless. There's lots of guys that have learned this technique on their own, through various experiments or YouTube tutorials, things like that. But it doesn't do me any good if I can't teach a choir of 200 people to do it in an afternoon.
Yeah. So that was kind of all about, overtone singing and how, that's basically the big topic. We're going to move on into, fry, ingressification. And my first question to open all this up is, there are a lot of, young basses who are in choir, and they think the bass section is the coolest, and they go to the bass section, they're like, hey, I could sing bass, and then they can't. So what they do is they push down to the notes. Like they're just, it's out of their range. One of my friends, good friend of mine, he's a tenor too, baritone around there. And he struggles to hit an A2, G2. And he's going down there and he just, what are the effects of this on your voice? And yeah, just what are the effects of that in your voice?
Yeah, I mean, it's the same thing with pushing your chest voice in your upper range. You might be able to crank out a couple of lower notes a couple of times, but after 10, 15 minutes, you're just going to fatigue the voice, and then you're gonna create a lot of swelling, and it's going to be very difficult to have clean adduction of the vocal folds. Things will dry out, and it won't be a pleasant sound. But it's the same thing as having a tenor try to belt a bunch of high C's over and over and over and over again. I mean, the reason I'm trying to develop some of these exercises is because there is value in blending your modal and pulse register the same way there's value in blending your head voice and chest voice. Yeah. If you can work on expanding each of those ranges and easing the transition between the two, then it's going to be a lot more sustainable as a bass to be able to flip in and out of those things. Tao is a perfect example of that. I even heard it at one of the ACDA conventions with the KC Chorale, and they were doing I think it was Duke Ellington gospel mass, blues mass, something like that. And I was sitting in like the third row or something like that. And he and one other guy were just belting like, I don't know, F1s, A1s, something like that. And it was totally blowing me away. I was like, this is crazy. Is this real? Is this not real? Like I couldn't quite put my finger on it. When I was talking to him, he's like, it's just so much easier, even though he could belt a low C with his chest voice, doing it with the subharmonics is just, it's like, well, I can just kind of sit back, chill, and crank out these notes without breaking a sweat using the subharmonics. So, why would I want to just like tire myself out and make it so much harder? The other thing for like, your friends in the bass section, everyone loves basses because bass is, that is the coolest section of the choir. When I was 14 and I was like right at the end, the middle end of my voice change, I was singing tenor 1 in one choir and bass 2 in the other choir. And I had maybe like a low E just below the staff. And it was, oh man, I looked like I was going to burst a blood vessel or something. I was essentially just burping, trying to hit those low notes. Yeah. And then once I started studying voice, my entire bottom range completely went away. I mean, to this day, I'm still a tenor, and I have a miserable modal range. My lowest note in my chest voice is like, on a good day, like C3. Like it's that, it is actually that bad. We if you know, you should definitely know Paul Mueller's music if you don't already, because he's one of the few composers that actually writes like really low bass lines. And there's this piece, Now Sleeps the Crimson Petal, and for like half the piece, the basses are just cranking B naturals. And we did that piece for Christmas, and the tenor twos have to go down to, you know, a low B. And I just like none of us could do it. We're like, are you kidding me? It's not a super high tenor part, but at the end you're just trying to push everything down. I mean, without the Strobos or VVM, I mean, I can't get anywhere near those pitches. So I mean, yeah, if people are comfortable in the bass section as a baritone, I would say, you know, it's very beneficial to learn some of these techniques because, you know, it's going to save you so much fatigue. Pressing down at the bottom of the staff does so much. It does more harm than good to really keep on pressing those things, because you can only really expand the range by learning to relax into those transitions.
Of course. Follow-up question. It's just, you know, the other end of the range. Would it be beneficial for, you know, a bass like myself or a baritone who just constantly singing, you know, middle C down to like F2, just say around there? Would it be beneficial for them to go to the tenor two parts and learn to sing higher in their chest, or use mixed and head or falsetto in that register and trying to smooth it out? Would that be beneficial for the whole of the voice?
Yes. As far as I know, there's no part of singing that does not benefit in some way from learning to expand the range and smooth transitions. I mean, every aspect of it. I mean, whether you're singing Gregorian chant at a church, you know, every day, and the entire range is just like this, or you want to go on and do opera, musical theater, choral music, whatever, there is a benefit to training the upper register and the lower register. And again, smoothing those transitions. I mean, geez, that's like 99% of what all of my voice lessons were from high school throughout undergrad and even into graduate school. You're just focusing on how can we get this smooth as possible, these transitions, because it's going to help everything else. There's a really interesting thing in Chesnikov's book. He talks about the basso profundo and the Octavists, and he says, he does like a breakdown of the range, and he says they're basically only useful under the staff. And he says, like, once they get into the staff, he describes it as being very unpleasant. And he says that he normally would just ask them to not sing. But to be honest, I think it's the same way that we have countertenors, you know? I have a good friend down in Texas. He's one of the Voces 8 scholars. Wow. Michael Skarke. He's an amazing countertenor, but he's a baritone. His natural voice. And here in Aberdeen, we had a couple of other countertenors, and both of them sang baritone. And you would think that, you know, maybe they would be tenors that are just kind of expanding their upper range, but they're able to really train the falsetto voice and then the modal voice somewhat independently, but blend between the two. So, I mean, the same way with subharmonics. I mean, like I said, I'm a tenor. I will never, ever get a job singing bass. I can tell you that for sure. But you know, I was practicing actually just yesterday. My girlfriend hit an F1 doing a Strobos technique, and she, I mean, you know, she can sing almost lower than I can in her chest voice, but you know, that's an octave that she never had access to before. So I think, yeah, there's you don't have to be a bass to learn these techniques. But yeah, I think it's really helpful to teach. Like when I teach choirs this, and when I develop the exercises, it's going to be for the whole choir. I mean, I do think there's a lot of benefit for teaching sopranos and altos and tenors how to do this, because the pulse register is another register of the voice, and not developing it and not utilizing it is, kind of silly. It's just like, it's one fewer trick that you have in the toolbox to mix metaphors.
All right. That'll bring us to our next question. I get told all the time, well, not all the time, just sometimes, but I get told that fry is unhealthy for the voice or things like that. And is that true? Is fry unhealthy for your voice? But not excessive. Not excessive.
Yeah. I've talked to, like, when I was starting to put together my research, and I was talking to a couple of friends of mine that are doing their DMAs in Wisconsin, and I can't remember where my other friend is studying. I think he's out in California. But I said basically, hey, do you want to kind of be one of my guinea pigs and try out this technique? And we singers get we're very protective of the vocal mechanism. I mean, it's so personal. This instrument is you. I know I have friends who've gotten polyps and nodes and things like that, and it's terrifying. I had my voice teacher my first voice teacher in undergrad. She told me, never clear your throat, never go ever. That's just, it's so bad for you. Don't ever do it. So we always kind of need to tread lightly, because it's not always about, it's not just about what is healthy and what's not healthy. It's also, are we doing something that is going to isolate ourselves from the rest of the vocal and pedagogical community? So I like to kind of take everything with a grain of salt. Right now, I'm doing things very slowly, and I'm very careful about how I do these experiments and with whom I do these experiments, because again, my friends that sing, professional, my friends that are opera singers or, touring soloists or whatever. I mean, they're just way too nervous to try a lot of these things. As far as I can say, I have seen no evidence that suggests that these things are cause long-term damage. However, there are different techniques with VVM that utilize different degrees of constriction on the throat. If you look at Conductor versus Sigit and some other things like that, some of those techniques, they are really constricting the throat to force the ventricular folds to adduct. And those are the styles. I mean, they produce very, very, very clear overtones, very high whistle-like things. But that is a very excessive amount of tension. And there is no use, currently there's no use in Western music or Western choral music for an excessive amount of tension, because also if you start training that kind of tension, then you might just carry that into, regular singing. And then we spend so much time as teachers trying to get singers to sing without that excessive tension. Mm-hmm. So, and that's also another reason why I try to stay away from a lot of these specific cultural terminology, because if you try to teach somebody Kargira or Sigit, they might watch a lot of videos and say, well, this person is going more, and you can just hear, there was one where the guy says, you have to imitate an animal, meh, meh, like that. And I mean, it's just, oh, it as a teacher, you just kind of cringe because you can just hear how aggressively the vocal folds are adducting. The ventricular folds are being activated as well, but it's not worth it to put that much strain on the vocal folds. That's how you get polyps. That's how you get nodes and things like that. So I try to take everything with a grain of salt. Fry singing, I have seen no evidence of that being unhealthy. It's a very natural part of the voice. I mean, when you wake up early in the morning and you just talk like this and you let the fry go, I mean, you can only produce the fry by relaxing the vocal folds. You know, if you put too much tension, I mean, if you're, and Tao Yang demonstrates this as well, if you're trying to do the Strobos and you put too much tension, it'll just pop out. You know, you can actually constrict it right away. So that is sort of a fail-safe with that technique. With the VVM, though, it's quite a bit riskier because there is constriction going on in the throat, and it's just really, really hard to navigate. One of the things that I like to do, and I've just started practicing with this, Ingo Tietze is a phenomenal pedagogue, and he created this technique called, straw singing through a straw. But I like it best with these like coffee stirrer, really, really thin straws.
Yeah.
And what you do is you will do your regular singing with the straw in your mouth, putting all that sound through the straw. And what that does is it creates more subglottal, it creates more back pressure. And it forces you to find an ideal balance between the subglottal pressure and the pressure on top. So there's not so much pressure going against the vocal folds, because that can cause the voice to tire out very, very, very quickly. When people talk about pressing, a lot of time subglottal pressure is way too high. So I like doing this because it pushes pressure back on the glottis, and you have to find that equilibrium. So it's really helpful for regular singing, but it also is very, very helpful for VVM, for Strobos, things like that, because you need a lot of breath for VVM. You need air moving in very big amounts. But if you move everything way too aggressively, it's going to take a negative effect on the vocal folds. So what you want to do is find a good pressure balance. So that's why I like, doing this. If you go back and forth between like the Strobos, like it's a good way, because again, I mean, I've been talking for God knows how long, like an hour. So my vocal folds are getting fatigued naturally.
Yeah.
So when I try to flip into the Strobos, it's a lot more difficult. But this is one of those techniques that helps you, okay, here's how we balance things. So there are ways to do it healthily. I haven't found too much research that has said it's unhealthy, but VVM can be. I can see a lot of ways that VVM can be potentially very damaging to the voice if done incorrectly. So that's why I'm hoping at the end of my PhD, I'll be able to produce a document that just says, here are the exercises that we can do, we can teach to acquire, that you can do in your voice lessons and things like that. And we know these things are going to work, and we know they're healthy. And as long as you do it this way, it's sustainable.
All right, Joe, I'm going to give you one last question, and then we're going to do the final goodbye thingamabobby that we do here at TalkBox with Oktavists. So go ahead, Joe. Give your last question.
This is my actual last question that I've written down, so thank you. And I know the answer is probably going to be no, but are you a purist when it comes to classifying an Oktivist? Because I know a lot of people are saying Oktivists are only in chest. but there are so many people that, that are just so loud. Like I know Xander's one of them. He's using VVM to blast, B flat ones over an entire choir. And I know that Bass Tu Yang has incredible subharmonic usage, which could, is in the Oktavists range.
I don't believe that you actually can be a purist in that regard. We need to look at it the same way that we talk about German Fox. That's the German system of voice types. And there's, the soprano, mezzo-soprano, tenor, baritone, bass, and then all of the subcategories. Well, contralto as well. Then there's all the subcategories. The bel cantos, the coloraturas, cantates, líricos, liricospintos, etc. But when you really look at it, those different voice types are a lot more just descriptions of the repertoire than they are descriptions of the voice. There's a lot of singers, there's a lot of sopranos that can sing, dramatic, romantic, lyric very, very easily. So it's really the music itself that kind of puts that kind of category on it. So I look at Oktavists the same way. If I can teach a soprano to hit an F1 and get her to really project it, and if I wrote a choral piece and it's got an F1 and I know she can sing it, I'm having her sing it, as long as it sounds good. I don't really care. It's the same thing with people compare, they do all these videos comparing like famous tenors doing high C's and high B's in the repertoire. And, some people, they're using too much head voice and they're using this or that. As long as it sounds good and is healthy and sustainable, who really cares? Yes, of course, it's always going to be very impressive when you meet somebody like Glenn Miller and you can just hear it in a speaking voice, and and he just says hi, and you say, "Oh my God, I think my phone was vibrating," or that, of course, that's wonderful, but I don't think there's really any value in trying to split hairs and say this is an Oktavis voice or this isn't. If they can sing the music, that's really all that matters. If it sounds good, and it's healthy, that's fine in my book.
Awesome.
So here at TalkBox with Oktavists, before our guest leaves, we do a challenge called "What is your lowest note?"
Oh God.
So Benjamin, are you ready to sing your lowest note using any vocal technique that you have?
Am I ready? Probably not. I'm going to really embarrass myself right now. I think first I should show you what my lowest modal note is, just to prove that I'm a tenor here.
You did hit a C3 earlier, by the way.
Yeah, like oh my God. It's about as low as it goes.
That was a B flat.
Oh, well, there we go. It's the fatigue. So see what I can do with the scroll boss. Yeah, I'm not sure I can even produce those low ones.
I think that was a B1.
I have no idea what that is.
I think that might have been around an F1 to an E flat 1.
Hold up. That's G1. You're an Oktavis, Benjamin. Should I join in?
I think that was a B flat one.
See, and it's really tricky again because I don't have those like medium low notes. So for me to drop down an octave, it sounds terrible. And when you listen to Fuchs, I mean, he starts on a B, like B3, because he goes.
All right.
Oh. I mean, he goes all the way down to the G1, but yeah. I mean, for me, yeah.
Before we go, I've been practicing this entire time while you and Joe have been talking. So let's see if there has been improvement before we leave. Hold up, gotta do the test. I feel so stupid, but it works. Does it sound better, Benjamin?
Yeah. Just keep working on opening up the backspace, and realize there's a third formant under your tongue that will control the overtones that you highlight.
Yeah.
And so if you focus on the lower ones, that'll get it to sound a little bit smoother across, because you're still highlighting a lot of high partials. And so it sounds very, very bright. So it'll cut through very easily. But just think dark and more of a kind of pyramid shape, if that makes sense.
All right, guys. Thanks for talking today. I appreciate it. And I hope to see you guys next time for the next interview.